Hi, my name is Dave Lannom with Modular Training, and welcome to today's module on schematic symbols and power flow. Let's start with a quick overview. Why are we talking about symbols? We'll talk about understanding the symbols and power flow. We'll talk about using all data to find the map key, and then we'll summarize. So the big question is, why are we starting here? In order to provide effective diagnostics, we've got to be able to read a schematic. When we understand what symbols are and what they mean, it allows us to visualize the vehicle as it relates to the schematic. And understanding power flow allows us to have a thorough understanding of how the circuit normally operates. When we have a map and we understand the power flow, we can quickly provide a confident, accurate diagnosis. Saving the guest time with a proper diagnosis always increases guest satisfaction, and satisfied guests provide more referrals with more opportunities for you in your bay. So, what's all that mean? I mean, let's picture it this way. You know, I'm I can't help it. I'm a grandpa. I live in Florida. My grandbabies are on the way to see me. I'm going to take them to Disney World, so I got out the map. And quite frankly, when I looked at that map of Disney World, it didn't really help me a lot. So what Disney did is they sent me a picture, same map, only they put pictures on the map to make it a whole lot easier for me. Now, that map I can understand. And it's really kind of the same way. I look at the average schematic and, it's kind of like just a map. But what if I want to go find an adult beverage someplace? Well, how can we take that picture and convert that picture into a tourist map? As we start to understand each one of the symbols on the schematic, we can place visually where those relays are, where the fuel pump is, where the individual ignition coils might be. All we need to know is what picture is each one of those symbols trying to paint for us. All we need to know is what picture is each one of those symbols trying to paint for us. The symbols display the representation of the component, and in some cases, the internal parts of that component. Internal parts that they may include a resistor, a diode, switch poles, a transistor coil. I mean, in some PCMs, ECMs, control modules, so to speak, there's even small micro relays built into them. It's important, though, that we refer to the symbol guide for each manufacturer because, unfortunately, different manufacturers may use a different symbol for the exact same components. But remember, many use symbols which they've designated to represent those components. Just keep in mind they're not all yet universal. Remember when we talked about basic electricity? We said there was a few things that we had to have. We had to have the source, we had to have the load, and we had to have a complete path. But now we need to know, when do I have the source? And there'll be specific call outs that, okay, this particular fuse, fuse number 4 in the upper left hand side, is I when the car's running. That makes sense. If I'm looking at something like a fuel pump, the headlights, there's things that I want on, when the car's running, but when I turn the car off, I don't want the fuel pump to keep on. So there's other components that are hot all the time. They're unswitched. All the keep alive memory in the car that's holding on to the memory and the trouble codes, those have to be maintaining battery power to keep their memory alive. When we start to look at that, we start to see other symbols in this thing. We look at a splice and that top splice, that splice ST33, right now we're maybe looking at just the heating and air conditioning controller. But keep in mind that splice means there's something else on that circuit, not related to the air conditioner. It could be going to the dashboard, could be going anywhere. We need to know that that splice is there if we ever need to diagnose something like a short ground in the total circuit. But we just need to keep those in the back of our mind that, okay, this isn't the whole wiring diagram. This is the wiring diagram for the piece that we're looking at. Now, when we get down to the connector, that connector is marked C1. And when we look at that C1, it's trying to tell me, okay, here's a connector, but we also see that there's a dashed line around that connector. In other words, that connector is part of another component. In this particular case, the heating or air conditioning controller. From there, we can look at each one of the terminals on that connector. We can see they're labeled A through F, but they're not always in a way, that makes a lot of sense. It makes sense, but when we look at the schematic to see what's going on, it's one view. But when we look at the connector, it may be another view altogether. And we'll talk about connector views here in just a minute. But remember that dashed line, because that dashed line is telling me that this component is part of a larger component. But we're only looking at, what we're concerned with is this particular system that we're working on. For instance, do I need to know what every fuse in the vehicle does? No. Obviously we're looking at fuse number 14. Obviously there's more fuses in the car, which means that fuse 14 is part of the bigger picture. In this case, the fuse box or the connector on the heating and air conditioning controller, when we're just looking at the fan speed, that's another piece that we're looking at. So we have to keep all of these pieces in mind as we continue to work. Now, again, each manufacturer will use different color codes, and I'll talk about how to get manufacturer specific information in a little bit here. But they'll tell me, okay, what color is the wire? In this case, it's purple with the black tracer. So we know, okay, if we're on connector one, that we're actually at the right point of the connector. So it makes my life a whole lot easier to know when I'm measuring that I'm measuring in the right place. From there, some manufacturers will also give me a specific circuit number so I can check that circuit and check that circuit very, very carefully. So now that we know what the symbols are and how to look at them now, what we need to do is we need to be able to go just take a quick journey through one circuit to see, okay, exactly what is the power flow doing? And what I mean by that is if I know where it starts and where it finishes, then I've got a clear map and it gives me a very quick, accurate diagnosis. Now, there's a couple tricks that I use to get through this, that I can look at very, very quickly. And one, remember when we talked in base electricity, don't forget the grounds, because there's not going to be a wire run all the way back to the negative plus to the battery. But where does that ground terminate? What does that ground share? I can actually go into all data. And when I'm in all data, I can just click on the ground side connection. Now, remember I told you we'd go back to that connector view? Well, let's talk about that too. Because sometimes if we have to measure between one point of a connector and another point of a connector, it can be confusing. I mean, some of these connectors have 20, 30, 40, 60, 90 pins or 3 or 4 connections into one electronic control module. So it tells me a little bit about it. It tells me, okay, what color is the connector? And as I look at the face of the connector, it'll tell me exactly what each terminal number is to make that a whole lot easier to do the diagnostic process. So let's walk through the power flow on this simple steering column line. So basically, here's the situation. This particular point, the customer gets in the car. He puts the car in reverse. He puts the car in drive, and the steering lock won't release. Kind of like when you turn it too far, and you take the key out. Sometimes you got to jiggle the steering wheel a little bit. Well, sometimes that lock is not manual, but it's electric. So let's walk through how it works. And the first thing I'd want to know is, find the fuse and how much amperage is the fuse rated for? Is the fuse good? And at that particular point, I can take a look at the schematic and it tells me, yep, that's a 10 amp fuse. Then, okay, where's the switch? Okay, where's the electronic switch at in this thing? And when's it supposed to be open or closed? So again, I look inside the dash line and the park position switch is always closed when it's in park. But keep in mind that switch doesn't sit by itself. Remember those dashed lines we were talking about? That dashed line is around, it's 2 terminals inside the automatic transmission control, or the BTSI, they called it in this particular case. But remember, it's not just 2 terminals there. This is part of a bigger component surrounded by a dashed line. So from there, I've got to find the ground. And according to the zoning chart, where would I find the ground? Well, I look down at the ground and I know that ground number is G200. And I know it's in the dash. And how did I know it's in the dash? Remember where we started? We went over the all data We looked at the locations and we looked at the ground locations. We looked up ground G200. We found it's right there in the dashboard. Oh, but there's those dashed lines again. And the dashed lines are coming off a splice. That splice number S230 means there's more than one thing attached to the ground G200. Why is that so important to me? Well, if I think I have a bad ground G200, usually the other things that are attached to that, I look at the ground distribution to say, hang on a minute here. If it's faulting out this circuit, shouldn't be also be faulting other circuits that should be attached to that ground. So you can see how valuable that ground and those dash lines can become for us. Now, is the ground the only thing used by the power supply? No, I already gave that one up. That dashed line tells me, nope, there's more to it. And if I want to know, I need to go to the ground distribution and I'll take a look at cell number 14. Well, from there, what I need to know is the parking position switch, the only switch in the automatic transmission control. And quite frankly, I don't think so. Don't think so. Remember, there's a dash line around that switch, which tells me, hang on a minute, sports fans, there's more to here that meets the eye. But once again, when we're only dealing with the steering column part, that's the only two pieces of that connector that I need. Remember that big map? All I needed is to follow the path to what I'm working on, which is the steering column part. So from there, if I'm going to test the switch, which terminals would I go to? Yeah, I go to terminals number C and terminal F. Pretty straightforward. Do the basic testing we already talked about when we did meters, and it made life a whole lot easier for us. Remember, if that switch was open, what would the available voltage be? Well, I take a look at that circuit and I can say, okay, I've got battery voltage in, and that switch is open. I should have potential voltage. Remember, the open and close switch. And if the switch was open, well, I should see 12 volts. And if the switch is closed, well, I should see zero. So let's take a look at how to actually put this into some practical application using the all data system. So let's take a look inside of all data and see how that works. So we're going to start by opening up all data. Again, we're working on the 215 2015. We'll open up all data. And again, we're working on a 2015 Toyota Camry. I'm going to go down to the diagrams and I'm always going to use the interactive color coding. So, and then I'll show you why here in just one second. So I'm going to come down at this particular point and I want to take a look at the horn circuit, and it's not a hybrid. So we're going to say accept a hybrid. Now, to make this schematic actually usable, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the schematic, and at that particular point, I'll actually be able to begin to work. Now, keep in mind, I may not be able to remember all of the symbols that we've already talked about, and that can be frustrating at times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down right here on the information button, and when I do that, I can actually open up a symbols key. So now I can take and basically make that my picture map. It'll tell me what's a fuse, what's a circuit breaker, exactly which part of what relay I'm looking at, and it really makes my job a whole lot easier being able to just simply work through the schematic that way. So now I've got my pictures, and then I can do the power flow. Again, we've already talked about, okay, I'm going to need power. And once I've seen the power come in, I can track the power all the way through the relay, all the way over, up the green wire, back down, and I can see where I'm actually getting my ground through the horn switch. On the other side of that circuit, I'll have battery positive power coming through the switch inside the relay. When we close the switch inside that relay, I'm then able to sound the horns, and we'll notice that the horns are actually grounded right there in front of the engine compartment. But by understanding the power flow, I can work quickly and accurately through the simple horn circuit. And I can also, whenever I forget what one any singular component could be, I can always go back down to my symbols key and I can see exactly what each one of those symbols represents that may be manufacturer specific or something I might have forgotten. So let's summarize real quick. Remember, let the symbols draw a picture. If I'm looking at it at the schematic in the bigger sense, visualize what the component is. If it's a relay, it's a relay. Same way that I looked at my Disney World map. If I decided I needed an adult beverage, I could look at that picture, know exactly where to go. So from there, understand the power flow. If I know how the electricity is traveling through the circuit, it makes my life just so much simpler to be able to diagnose and repair it. And when you forget something, don't worry about it. Use the all data symbols key. It'll tell you, okay, everything that you forgot, everything that I forgot is right there for me. Everything from the wire color code abbreviations right down to the symbols and know what each symbol on that map means. Hope this module has been useful for you. Thank you.